Is it true that short people have an easier time with the squat? Well, sort of. Let me explain. We've reached part 3 of 3 in the series of how our body type affects our strength with the major movement patterns. If you haven't checked out the first 2 videos about the bench press and deadlift, I highly recommend checking those out. I'll link to them in the description. Today's video, as many of you who have watched the last 2 may guess, is about the squat. As I've covered in both the previous videos of the series, this series is not only about how our anatomy affects the way that we move and our strength with different movements, as well as techniques to maximize our strength, but it's also about not comparing yourself to others. There are so many anatomical variables, physiological variables, and so many other factors, countless other factors that affect how we move, that comparing yourself to anybody else besides yourself isn't fair to you and it's not fair to others. With that being said, let's get into how our anatomy affects the squat. The first factor that we covered in the last 2 videos about the bench press and the deadlift is also incredibly relevant here. The shorter the distance you have to move the weight, the easier it's going to be to move that weight, and the more weight you're going to be able to move as a result. The difference between the deadlift, the bench press, and now the squat is that the squat has way fewer technique variations that you can do to decrease that distance artificially while still achieving the depth that is necessary. Sure, you can widen your stance somewhat and that will slightly decrease the distance that you have to actually move the bar, but the little bit of decrease in distance that you get will be offset by the fact that your feet aren't going to be in their ideal position for your own body. You need to keep your feet at a width that feels natural for your body and an amount of toe out that feels natural for your body in order to produce your maximum force. So increasing your foot stance just so that you can have a slightly shorter bar path is probably not a wise trade-off. And of course, you can just decrease the depth of your squat and that'll allow you to lift more. And maybe this is something that you already do, either because you are recovering from an injury or a surgery, you have some sort of anatomical limitation, or maybe just simply your own preference. And if that's the case, then keep on trucking, keep on doing what you're doing, do what's best for your body at all times. But since I can't make a video for every individual squat preference, we're gonna consider 1 rep of the squat being starting with the bar unracked in a fully upright standing position, flexing at the hips and knees eccentrically until you reach a depth where the crease of your hips drops below the top of your knees, and then pushing out of that position and coming back up to the starting position. We'll consider point A of the squat being the start and end position of full upright standing, and point B being the position of maximum depth. Although there are many variations of the squat, we're going to use the barbell high bar back squat as our benchmark in this video unless otherwise stated. I do have to warn you, we're going to nerd out here for a little bit, so hopefully I don't bore anybody to death, but just stick with me, it'll make sense in the end. To produce the maximum force during a squat, you need to keep your center of mass in line with the middle of your feet. Now, I don't want to take you back to my biomechanics or physics classes in college, so I'm going to try to keep this really simple. The center of mass or center of gravity is the point in space where your body mass is equally distributed in all directions. In upright standing, the center of mass falls in line with the belly button and the center of the pelvis in most individuals, but this can vary greatly depending on your body proportions. The center of mass or center of gravity moves when you move your body to account for different weight being distributed in different directions. At times, your center of gravity might actually be outside of your physical body. For instance, if you are standing and you hinge forward at the waist, your center of gravity is going to be actually outside of your body, somewhere around here. As our center of mass moves further away from the center of our base of support, which is our feet and the space between them, we lose the ability to produce force. And if our center of mass moves completely outside of our base of support, we actually will lose our balance. Now, as I said, the center of mass point that allows us to generate the most force during a squat is when it is in line with the middle of our feet. For this reason, the longer your femurs or thigh bones are in relation to your torso, the further away your hip joint will get from the center of your feet, which will make the squat feel more difficult. Think about it this way. Is it easier to hold a heavy box straight out in front of you with your arms extended, or is it easier to hold that same heavy box tight up against your chest? It's way easier to hold it when it's tight up against your chest. This is because the further away a weight gets from the joint producing the force or the fulcrum, the more force it has to be produced in order to carry that same weight. This is just a basic principle of physics that can be described by work equals force times distance. Now let's apply the same frame of mind to the squat. The longer your femurs or thigh bones are, the further the fulcrum, or your hips in this case, move from the center of your feet. This makes the exercise feel harder when you get at the bottom of the movement and you need to come back up. This also describes why we have to hinge at the hips when we do a squat, especially a back squat, because if you try to keep your chest too upright, your center of mass will fall farther back in your base of support, and you'll have to compensate to avoid losing your balance. During a front squat, you'll notice that you can keep your chest more upright. This is because the weight is being held anteriorly to your body, which counteracts the need for the hip hinge. So you can keep your chest more upright, and more of your weights can be sitting forward in the center of your feet without having to do that hip hinge. And that upright chest and weight being anterior to your body also explains why the front squat targets the quadriceps more than the back squat does. Okay, thanks for sticking with me. I'm sorry for that nerdy physics lesson, but now let's get into how your body proportions affect how you stack up during the squat. First off, like we started off in the video, shorter people do in fact have a shorter distance to move the weight and therefore have a biomechanical advantage there. However, people who have a shorter femur to height ratio also have a biomechanical advantage. So that means that the people who have the greatest advantage with the squat genetically are shorter people with a smaller than average femur to height ratio. On the other hand, the people that have the greatest disadvantage with the squat are taller individuals who have a longer femur to height ratio. A study that looked at these ratios in men and women found that for men, the femur made up 23.2% of overall height on average and 24.9% of height for women. You can find out where you fall on that scale by measuring the distance between your hip bone and the joint line of your knee. As always, keep in mind there are significant variations in these numbers from person to person, and it does not mean something is wrong with you if your ratio varies from that of the average. You may fall anywhere on the scale for body proportion advantages or disadvantages for the squat. For instance, my body height is taller than average. I'm 6'3" tall, which is a biomechanical disadvantage for the squat. However, I have a short femur to height ratio compared to the average man, which is a biomechanical advantage. I'm 75 inches tall with a greater trochanter to knee joint line height of 16.25 inches. That means my femur to height ratio is 21.7%, which is shorter than the average of 23.2% for men. Now, if you are somebody who is built with a biomechanical disadvantage for the squat, don't let that affect your training. As with any exercise, your progress is mostly related to consistent progressive overload of the exercise, not on your body type. Plus, there are lots of people that don't have what you consider the ideal body type for the squat that can lift a ton of weight. Plus, unless you're competing in powerlifting at a really high level, the actual amount of weight that you're lifting really doesn't matter. Compare yourself to your past self. As long as you are getting better, you are working to get better every day, you are on the right track. But just for kicks, test this out and let me know where you fall on the scale. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.